I never thought I would return to smoke. When my command vessel broke through the upper atmosphere of Sorath Prime, the first thing I saw was fire. Not the warm, controlled burn of our thermal vents, or the soft glow of our city lights at dusk. This was the sharp, ugly fire of war. Columns of black smoke rising from the colony districts, Dravik cruisers hanging in orbit like steel predators, and the colony beacon completely silent where it should have been singing. My hands tightened on the navigation console. My second-in-command, Advisor Yeth, said nothing beside me. There was nothing to say. The Dravik Imperium had come while I was away. I had been traveling for 60 days, attending the Galactic Concord's Treaty Summit on the far side of the system, a summit the Dravik themselves had requested. I understood now what that summit had really been. A distraction. A door held open while someone crept through the window behind us. While I sat in a chamber of silk and diplomatic language, their fleet had crossed the border and descended on my world, on my children. My 47 children, sealed inside their metamorphic pods in the deep brood chambers beneath the colony, sleeping the deep biological sleep of metamorphosis, completely helpless, completely unaware, locked in a stasis they could not wake from for another 30 cycles. They could not run. They could not call for help. They simply slept, trusting that the world above them was safe. I pushed the vessel hard into the descent. The colony looked like a mouth that had been struck. Buildings were cracked open. The outer guard towers were dark and cold. But as I dropped lower, reading the blast patterns and the weapon scarring on the ground below, something began to feel wrong. Wrong in a way that did not match the picture of a finished battle. The Dravik were still positioned at the outer perimeter of the brood tunnels. Their soldiers were still active, still moving in tactical formations. They had not won yet. Something was stopping them. I landed half a kilometer from the main brood entrance and went in alone, against every piece of training I had ever received. My advisors would have been furious. I did not care. My children were down there. The tunnels were dark. Our bioluminescent corridor panels had been destroyed or drained, and the only light came from the soft emergency strips near the floor. Pale blue lines that turned everything ghostly and thin. I moved through the silence with my plasma blade drawn, reading the walls. There were scorch marks I did not recognize. There were collapsed sections of corridor that had been brought down deliberately, not by Dravik weapons but from the inside. Someone had sealed passages. Someone had built walls out of rubble and fused them shut with focused heat. I found the first body 40 meters in. A Dravik scout, in full infiltration armor, face down on the tunnel floor. I turned it over with my foot. The wounds were not from any weapon I could identify. Something angular, something improvised, something driven with considerable force and considerable anger. I found a second body, 12 meters further, a third around the next bend, slumped against a wall that had been sealed with what appeared to be the melted casing of a mining drill. 11 bodies in total, between the tunnel entrance and the inner brood chamber door. 11 Dravik soldiers, in 19 days, stopped by something inside this tunnel that was not Sorath. I pushed open the inner chamber door. The smell hit me first. The warm, organic scent of the metamorphic pods. That deep amber smell that I had known since I first laid them, layered now with the sharp bite of scorched metal and something else, something unfamiliar. Human sweat, I realized later. The specific, distinct chemical signature of a human body under sustained stress. He was crouched between two pods in the center of the chamber. Sergeant Marcus Hale, the human the Galactic Concord had assigned to our colony 6 months earlier as a technical observer, did not hear me enter. He was focused on the far wall, where he had rigged what appeared to be a tension-based pressure trap using our colony's thermal irrigation pipes and a series of pins fashioned from structural alloy. His left arm was bound in a rough splint made from a broken panel rod and strips of his own uniform. His face was gaunt, hollowed by days without proper food. His beard had grown in thick and uneven. There was a long, partially healed cut across his left cheekbone. In his right hand, he held a plasma cutter, set to its narrowest beam, because he had clearly been using it for both welding and defense. In his left, the injured hand, which should not have been able to grip anything, he held a piece of sharpened Sorath structural alloy, about 40 centimeters long, which he had apparently made himself. Around him, in a loose ring, my children slept. Every single pod, untouched. 47. Not one cracked, not one disturbed, not one cold. I stepped forward, and my boot caught a piece of debris. The sound was small, but the human moved instantly, spun, dropped low, brought both hands up, and then froze when he saw me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved across my face with the particular expression I had come to recognize in him during his 6 months at the colony. The expression of a man rapidly organizing information. Then he straightened, slowly, and said, "Your Majesty, they kept sending people in small groups. That was their first mistake." His voice was hoarse. He had been in these tunnels for 19 days. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the chamber around him, at the traps along the walls, at the sealed corridors, at the bodies I had passed on the way in. I looked at my children, sleeping peacefully in their pods, as though the world above them had not tried very hard to end. I said, "How?" Not a question, really, more the only word I could find. He told me, in the flat, practical way that I had always found slightly unnerving about him, that the Dravek had made 3 attempts on the chamber. The first had come on day 2, a small forward team, and he had collapsed the access corridor on them using the mining charges he had found in the colony's maintenance bay. The second had come on day 7, a larger group that had found an alternate route through the irrigation subtunnels. He had let them come 3/4 of the way in, and then triggered the pressure system he had built from the irrigation pipes, which he described without drama as pretty effective. The third attempt had come on day 14, a single, highly trained infiltration scout who had found a route Marcus had not anticipated. The only time, he said, that he had been genuinely scared. He had won that one by hand. I did not ask him to elaborate. The cut on his cheek and the splint on his arm said enough. What I kept coming back to, standing in that chamber, was the 6 months before all of this. I thought about Marcus Hale jogging through the colony before dawn, when every sensible being was still asleep. I thought about the way he had walked the tunnels during his first week, not because he was lost, but, I understood now, because he was memorizing them. I thought about the questions he had asked our engineers about the irrigation system pressure tolerances, which our engineers had answered, because he seemed merely curious. I thought about the afternoon I had found him in the maintenance bay, turning a piece of structural alloy over in his hands, studying it with that quiet, organized attention he gave to everything. He had been building a plan, not because he expected to use it, simply because the plan existed in his mind the way a door exists in a wall, not always opened, but always there. The Dravek commander, when he received no signal from his third wave of scouts, made a decision I should have anticipated. He ordered a full breach. If the chamber could not be taken cleanly, it would be destroyed. The order came through on a Dravek command frequency that Marcus had been monitoring. He had pulled a functional comm receiver from one of the bodies on day 3 and had been listening ever since. He told me, very calmly, that we had approximately 40 minutes. What happened in those 40 minutes was not what the Dravek had designed for. Marcus walked me through the tunnel network he had spent 19 days preparing, explaining each pressure point, each sealed corridor, each rigged junction, with the same tone a builder uses when showing someone a house they are proud of. The system was intricate. It was improvised from colony materials, from salvaged equipment, from pieces of things that had been built for entirely different purposes. And it was designed, specifically, around the geometry of Sorath tunnels and the tactical patterns he had observed from 3 Dravek assault attempts. He had been learning them while they were trying to kill him. At the back of the chamber, behind a panel he had resealed with the plasma cutter, he had found something I had believed destroyed in the initial attack. Our colony's emergency resonance horn, the deep-frequency signal device that our guardcast was biologically tuned to respond to across a range of 30 kilometers. One of its power feeds had been severed. He had repaired it with components pulled from a Dravek Scout's compact, rerouted through our irrigation system's power backbone. He said, "I didn't know if it would work. I figured it was worth trying." I activated the horn. The sound moved through the ground like something alive. It went out through the rock and the soil and the ruins above us, 30 kilometers in every direction, and every Sorath Guardcast member who had survived the initial attack and scattered into the surrounding wilderness, every soldier who had been hiding, grieving, assuming the colony was already lost, felt it in their bones and turned toward home. The Dravek assault came hard and fast down every approach corridor. They came expecting to push through a broken tunnel system to a defenseless chamber. Instead, they came into a network of pressure traps and sealed choke points that funneled them, again and again, into positions where their numbers meant nothing. And behind them, coming in from the outside, drawn by the horn, came my guard caste, disorganized, exhausted, but alive and furious. The Dravik fleet held orbit for 6 more hours before they calculated that the cost of continuing was no longer acceptable. Then they left. They did not announce their departure. They simply stopped being there, the way bullies stop being there when the situation no longer favors them. In the silence that followed, I stood in the brood chamber and watched my children begin to wake. Metamorphosis does not end gently. It ends in stages, a shift in pod color, a vibration in the casing, and then the slow, wet emergence of new life into a world it has not seen before. They came out one by one, blinking in the low light, making the soft, uncertain sounds of the newly transformed. They found Marcus Hale sitting on the floor with his back against a pod casing, too tired to stand. They swarmed him immediately, in the way that newly transformed Sorath young swarm anything large and warm and present, and he sat in the middle of them, with the patient, exhausted look of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything. Our healers reached him within the hour. He was mildly furious about the attention, and said so several times. In the polite but firm way he said most things. They treated him anyway. It took longer than it should have, because Sorath medicine had not been designed for human biology, and several of our physicians had to stop and consult materials they had never expected to need. When the Galactic Concord's ambassador arrived 3 days later for the formal assessment, she asked me, in her clipped official way, to describe the role the human observer had played in the defense of Sorath Prime. I thought about the question for a moment. I thought about 11 bodies in a dark tunnel. I thought about a man with a broken arm and a piece of sharpened metal, crouched between sleeping children in the dark, for 19 days, alone. I said, he played the role of a Sorath mother. The ambassador wrote something in her report. I did not particularly care what. On the 4th day after the battle, I found Marcus standing at the edge of the colony's upper platform, looking out at the landscape. The smoke was nearly gone by then, and the sun was doing what it always did on Sorath Prime in the early morning, turning the plains the color of deep water. He looked like a man who had just remembered that the world was large. I stood beside him and asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I had found him in the chamber. I asked him why he stayed. He was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he turned the question over the way he turned everything over, carefully, looking for the truest version of it, and he said, "They were kids." He looked out at the plains. What else was I going to do? I had no answer for that. I was not sure an answer existed, or needed to. Some things are not questions waiting for logic. Some things are simply true, the way the sun is true, without argument, without condition, without any particular need to explain themselves. I stood beside him in the morning light, and my world was still standing, and my children were alive, and the human who had kept them that way was looking at the horizon with tired eyes and asking me, genuinely, what the alternative could possibly have been. I did not tell him that in 40 years of ruling, I had never met anyone quite like him, but I thought it.